My name is Bonnie Collins, and I am 28 years old. And the day I realized my own family had been systematically destroying my life, I understood that survival meant becoming someone I never thought I could be. It started with what seemed like concern when I moved back home after losing my job at the marketing firm, but it ended with me weighing 93 pounds and planning an escape that would expose the monsters living under the same roof as me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning everything changed. I was standing in the kitchen of my childhood home, making coffee with hands that shook so badly I could barely hold the pot steady, and my stepmother Janet walked in, wearing her pristine white robe like she was floating on air, instead of walking on the same linoleum floor where I used to sit and do homework 20 years ago. She looked at me with that expression I'd grown to recognize over the past 6 months since I'd moved back in, the one that made me feel like I was something unpleasant she'd found stuck to her shoe, and she said in that voice that always sounded like she was talking to a disobedient child even though I was a grown woman with a college degree and 8 years of work experience behind me. She said, "Bonnie, we need to discuss your living situation here because frankly your father and I are concerned about your eating habits and your general lack of contribution to this household." I set the coffee pot down harder than I meant to and felt the ceramic handle crack under my grip, because even though I'd been hearing variations of this speech for months, something about the way she said eating habits made my stomach clench with a fear I couldn't name yet. I turned to look at her, really look at her, and noticed how her eyes moved over my body like she was taking inventory of every pound I'd lost since Christmas. Every bone that had started showing through my skin, every hollow that had appeared in my cheeks, where there used to be the soft roundness that my father always said reminded him of my mother. Janet had never liked that comparison, and I was starting to understand that she'd found a way to erase it completely. My father walked into the kitchen, then carrying his newspaper and wearing the same blue striped pajamas he'd had for as long as I could remember, and when he saw me standing there with my hands wrapped around a coffee mug that felt too heavy for my weakened grip, he didn't meet my eyes the way he used to when I was growing up. Instead, he sat down at the table and spread his paper out like a wall between us, and said without looking up that he thought Janet was right, that maybe it was time for me to start taking more responsibility for my choices. I felt something cold settle in my chest then, because choices implied that I had been making decisions about what was happening to me when the truth was that every meal had become a negotiation. Every bite of food had to be earned through chores that grew more elaborate and time-consuming each week. And every attempt I made to buy my own groceries or cook my own meals was met with comments about waste and selfishness and how I was taking advantage of their generosity by eating food I hadn't paid for. Janet sat down across from my father and folded her hands on the table in a way that made me think of a teacher about to deliver a lecture, and she began explaining their new system for my continued residence in what she kept calling their home. Even though I'd grown up in this house, even though my bedroom still had the same lavender walls I'd painted when I turned 16. Even though every family photo on the mantel included my face until Janet had quietly replaced them with pictures that somehow only featured her and my father at various events I'd never been invited to. She told me that effective immediately I would be responsible for earning every meal through a point system they'd devised where household tasks would be assigned different values, and I would need to accumulate enough points each day to qualify for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. She pulled out a laminated chart that looked like something you'd use to potty train a toddler and slid it across the table toward me, while explaining that simple tasks like washing dishes would earn me 5 points, while more complex jobs like scrubbing the basement floor or reorganizing the garage would be worth 15 or 20. I stared at the chart, feeling my brain struggle to process what she was telling me because the numbers didn't make sense. Breakfast was listed as costing 20 points. Lunch was 25 and dinner was 30, which meant I would need to earn 75 points just to eat 3 basic meals. And even the highest value tasks would only get me partway there unless I spent every waking hour cleaning and organizing and maintaining their house like an unpaid servant. When I tried to point this out, Janet's expression shifted into something that looked almost pleased, and she said that was exactly the idea, that if I wanted to continue living here rent-free, I needed to understand that everything had a cost, and that contribution meant sacrifice. She said the word sacrifice like it was something holy, like she was offering me a gift instead of describing a system designed to slowly starve me into submission. My father finally looked up from his newspaper then, and I searched his face for any sign of the man who used to read me bedtime stories and take me fishing on Saturday mornings and teach me how to change a tire in the driveway of this same house. But all I saw was a stranger who nodded along when Janet explained that this was for my own good, that I'd become too dependent and needed to learn self-sufficiency and personal responsibility. I wanted to scream that I'd been supporting myself for 8 years before I lost my job, that I'd never asked to move back home, that I'd only come here because they'd insisted I shouldn't struggle alone when I could be surrounded by family who loved me. I wanted to remind my father that he'd raised me to believe family meant unconditional support and safety, and that home was supposed to be the place you could always return to when the world got too heavy to carry alone. Instead, I heard myself asking, in a voice that sounded smaller than I meant it to, what would happen if I didn't earn enough points for a meal? And Janet smiled in a way that made my skin crawl, and said that would be a learning opportunity, that missing a meal or two would help me understand the importance of commitment and follow through. That first day I threw myself into the tasks on the chart with the desperate energy of someone who still believed this was temporary, that if I just proved I could play by their rules, everything would go back to normal. I scrubbed bathrooms until my knees were raw from kneeling on tile floors. I reorganized closets that didn't need organizing. I washed windows that were already clean, and by the end of the day I had earned exactly 68 points. 7 points short of enough food to sustain a grown woman, 7 points short of basic human dignity, 7 points short of being treated like a family member, instead of an unwelcome burden who had to earn the right to survive in the house where she'd grown up. When I sat down at the dinner table that night, Janet looked at my chart and made a small, disappointed sound with her tongue against her teeth, and said that unfortunately I hadn't quite met the requirement for dinner, but that she was sure I'd do better tomorrow. She and my father ate pot roast and mashed potatoes while I sat there with an empty plate watching them, and trying to understand how people who claimed to love me could find it so easy to watch me go hungry. That night I lay in my childhood bed with my stomach cramping from emptiness and stared at the glow in the dark stars I'd stuck to the ceiling when I was 12. And tried to figure out when my father had stopped being the man who would have fought anyone who tried to hurt his daughter, and had become someone who could sit across from me while I starved and act like it was a lesson I needed to learn. The system got worse as the weeks went on because Janet began adding new requirements that weren't on the original chart tasks that had to be completed to her satisfaction, which seemed to be a moving target that shifted based on her mood and her desire to find fault with everything I did. A bathroom wasn't clean unless every grout line had been scrubbed with a toothbrush. A kitchen wasn't organized unless every can in the pantry was lined up with labels facing forward. A living room wasn't dusted unless every book had been removed from every shelf and wiped down individually. I began to understand that the point system wasn't really about earning meals. It was about control, about breaking me down until I was too weak and too grateful for any small kindness to question what was happening to me. Janet would sometimes award me extra points for tasks I'd already completed just to watch the relief flood my face when I realized I might actually eat that day, and other times she would find reasons to deduct points for infractions I hadn't known were possible, like using too much cleaning solution, or taking too long to complete a task, or failing to read her mind about some additional requirement she hadn't mentioned. My father became a ghost in his own house, drifting from room to room without making eye contact, avoiding any conversation that might force him to acknowledge what his wife was doing to his daughter. When I tried to talk to him alone, he would find reasons to leave the room or call Janet to join us, or suddenly remember urgent errands that required his immediate attention. The weight began falling off me in a way that felt violent, like my body was consuming itself to stay alive, and when I looked in the bathroom mirror I started to see a stranger looking back. Someone with sunken cheeks and prominent collarbones, and eyes that seemed too large for her face. My clothes hung on me like fabric draped over a skeleton, and when I tried to buy smaller sizes, Janet made comments about the expense of new clothes and suggested that maybe I should focus on getting healthy instead of worrying about how I looked. Getting healthy in Janet's vocabulary seemed to mean accepting that I deserved whatever was happening to me, that my presence in their house was such a burden that I should be grateful for any food they allowed me to earn, that questioning their system meant I was ungrateful and entitled, and needed to learn humility through suffering. I stopped calling my friends because I didn't know how to explain why I sounded so tired all the time, why I couldn't meet them for lunch or dinner, why I had to decline every invitation because I wasn't allowed to leave the house until my daily tasks were completed, and by the time I finished scrubbing and organizing and cleaning, it was too late for social plans. The isolation felt as deliberate as the hunger, like they were systematically cutting me off from anyone who might notice what was happening or offer me a way out. My job search became impossible, because I didn't have the energy to write coherent cover letters or the mental clarity to perform well in interviews, and when potential employers called to schedule phone screenings, Janet would sometimes forget to give me the messages or claim she hadn't heard the phone ring. When I asked to use their computer to apply for jobs online, she would find reasons why it wasn't available, or suggest that maybe I should focus on completing my household responsibilities before taking on the additional stress of employment. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in March when I woke up and realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd eaten a full meal, that my hands shook constantly. Now that I got dizzy when I stood up too quickly, that I'd started hoarding packets of crackers from restaurants I'd visited months earlier before the point system began, because I was always hungry and always afraid of being hungrier. I walked into the kitchen that morning to find Janet reorganizing the refrigerator, and when she saw me, she smiled in that way that had learned to make my heart race with.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Anxiety, and said that she'd been thinking about our arrangement and had decided that perhaps the point system wasn't challenging enough, that maybe I needed additional motivation to really commit to changing my lifestyle and taking responsibility for my choices. She pulled out a new chart, one that looked even more elaborate than the first, and explained that she'd added a category for personal development tasks like reading self-help books about motivation and productivity, and writing daily journal entries about my goals and progress, and completing online courses about financial literacy and job search strategies. These tasks, she said, would be worth more points because they were investments in my future, but they would also be required in addition to the household tasks, not instead of them. I looked at the new chart and felt something break inside me, because even with perfect completion of every single task, including the new personal development requirements, I would barely earn enough points for 2 meals a day, and that assumed that Janet approved of everything I did, that she didn't find reasons to deduct points, that she didn't add new requirements at the last minute. When I tried to explain this to her, she looked at me with what seemed like genuine confusion and said that maybe the problem wasn't the system but my approach to it, that maybe I needed to be more creative about finding additional ways to contribute, that maybe I was limiting myself by thinking of this as just about household tasks, when really it was about becoming the kind of person who adds value to every situation. That afternoon, while Janet was at her book club and my father was at work, I sat in my childhood bedroom surrounded by furniture that had once represented safety and comfort, and made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness. I couldn't continue living like this, couldn't continue pretending that what was happening to me was normal or temporary or something I deserved, and I couldn't wait for my father to remember who he used to be and protect me the way he'd promised he always would when I was small. I had been documenting everything without really planning to, taking photos of the point charts, keeping track of my weight loss, writing down the conversations and confrontations in a notebook I hid under my mattress, because some part of me understood that what was happening wasn't legal, that adults couldn't be starved and controlled and manipulated like this, even by family members who claimed it was for their own good. Looking through my notes that afternoon, I realized I had evidence of systematic abuse, that I had proof of deliberate starvation, that I had documentation of psychological manipulation and control that would shock anyone who saw it. I had weights and dates and photos and detailed accounts of conversations that revealed the calculated cruelty behind what Janet presented as concern and motivation and structure. But I also knew that having evidence and being able to use it were two different things, that Janet had spent months isolating me from anyone who might help me, that she'd positioned herself as the concerned stepmother trying to help her troubled stepdaughter get back on her feet, while I'd become the unreliable narrator of my own life, someone whose judgment couldn't be trusted because I was clearly struggling with mental health and personal responsibility issues. I started planning my escape that day, not a dramatic midnight flight, but a careful strategic withdrawal that would get me out safely and in a position to expose what had been done to me. I began researching resources for abuse victims and discovered that what I was experiencing had a name: that financial abuse and food restriction and isolation were recognized forms of domestic violence, even when they happened between family members, even when they were disguised as help or motivation or tough love. The hardest part was accepting that my father had chosen his wife over his daughter, that he was not going to save me, that whatever man had raised me and loved me and promised to protect me had been replaced by someone who could watch me waste away without intervening. I had to grieve the loss of the parent I thought I had while simultaneously planning to escape the parent I actually had, and that grief felt almost heavier than the hunger. I knew I would only get one chance to leave, that if I tried and failed, Janet would find ways to make my situation even worse, that she would frame any attempt to seek help as evidence of my instability and manipulation and inability to take responsibility for my actions. I had to be certain that when I walked out of that house, I had somewhere safe to go, and a plan that would expose the truth about what had happened to me in a way that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. The opportunity came 3 weeks later when Janet announced that she and my father would be spending a long weekend visiting her sister in Portland, and that they trusted me to maintain the house and continue working through my personal development tasks while they were gone. She left me with a detailed schedule of tasks that would have been impossible to complete in twice the time she'd allocated, and a refrigerator that had been strategically emptied of anything that could constitute a meal, leaving only condiments and expired leftovers that would force me to earn every bite of food through points I couldn't possibly accumulate while they were away. I realized then that this weekend was meant to be my final test, that Janet intended to return to find me broken and desperate and completely dependent on her system for survival, that she wanted to prove to herself and my father that I was incapable of functioning without their structure and control, and that any independence I thought I wanted was just delusion and selfishness. Instead, I spent that weekend gathering every piece of evidence I'd collected over the past months, organizing it into a timeline that told the complete story of my systematic abuse, and reaching out to every resource I'd researched for help and support and guidance about how to expose what had been done to me. I photographed the point charts and the empty refrigerator and the scale that showed my dangerous weight loss, and I wrote detailed accounts of every conversation and confrontation and manipulation I'd endured. By Sunday night, I had a plan that felt solid enough to risk everything on, and a support system of advocates and counselors and legal advisors who understood what I was facing and were ready to help me navigate the process of escape and exposure and recovery. I had a place to stay and people who believed my story and a clear understanding of my rights and the laws that had been broken in the name of helping me become a better person. I also had a new understanding of who I was capable of becoming when survival depended on it, when protecting myself meant stepping into a version of strength I'd never needed before, when exposing the truth required courage I didn't know I possessed. I was no longer the broken woman who had moved back home seeking comfort and support. I was someone who had survived deliberate cruelty and systematic abuse and was ready to make sure it never happened to anyone else. The hardest part wasn't leaving the house where I'd grown up, or accepting that my father had failed me in ways I couldn't forgive. It was understanding that the people who were supposed to love me most had been willing to destroy me slowly and methodically, while convincing themselves they were helping me grow and change and become a better person. That level of self-deception and cruelty was almost harder to comprehend than the hunger and exhaustion and fear. But I also discovered something about myself that weekend, that I was stronger than they'd tried to make me believe, that their system of control and punishment had failed to break something essential in me, that even at 93 pounds and desperate with hunger, I was still capable of planning and fighting and protecting myself in ways that would expose their lies and hold them accountable for what they'd done. When Monday morning came, I was ready to step into the next phase of my life, one that would require me to tell my story to people who had the power to help me seek justice and ensure that Janet and my father faced consequences for their deliberate cruelty and systematic abuse. I was ready to stop being a victim and start being a survivor, ready to transform my pain into purpose and my experience into protection for others who might face similar manipulation and control. The woman who walked out of that house was not the same person who had moved back home 6 months earlier, seeking help and support during a difficult time. She was someone who had learned that family could be a source of profound danger, that love could be weaponized, that concern could mask cruelty, and that sometimes protecting yourself meant exposing the people who claimed to be protecting you. She was also someone who understood that healing would require telling the truth about what had happened, no matter how painful or complicated or difficult to believe, and that justice would require holding people accountable for their actions, even when those people were family, even when society expected her to forgive and forget, and move on for the sake of keeping peace. As I closed the door behind me for the last time, I carried with me not just the evidence of what had been done to me, but the determination to make sure their crimes were exposed, their methods were revealed, and their victims were protected. I was no longer their victim, I was their worst nightmare, someone who had survived their systematic abuse and was ready to tell the world exactly what they were capable of doing to someone they claimed to love. The morning I walked away from that house, I carried nothing but a backpack with my documentation and the clothes on my back that hung loose enough to slide off my shoulders if I moved too quickly. I had arranged to meet Detective Sarah Martinez at a coffee shop downtown because I knew I needed to report what had happened before Janet and my father returned from their weekend trip and discovered I was gone. The thought of them walking into that empty house and realizing their control had been broken filled me with a terror that made my hands shake as I pushed open the glass door of the cafe. Detective Martinez was already seated at a corner table away from the morning rush of customers getting their caffeine fixes before work, and when she looked up at me, I saw her expression shift from professional interest to genuine concern. She stood up to shake my hand, and I noticed how careful she was not to grip too tightly, as if she could see how fragile my bones had become, how little pressure it would take to cause damage to someone who had been systematically starved for months. She gestured for me to sit down and asked if I wanted to order something to eat or drink, and when I hesitated, trying to calculate whether I could afford even a small coffee with the few dollars I had left, she seemed to understand immediately and signaled the waitress without asking again. When the woman approached our table, Detective Martinez ordered 2 breakfast platters and coffee for both of us and told me quietly that this was part of the investigation, that documenting my physical condition required establishing my nutritional needs and current state. I felt tears start to form at the corners of my eyes because it had been so long since someone had simply offered me food without conditions or requirements or point systems, that the basic human kindness of being fed felt overwhelming. I pulled out the notebook where I had documented everything and set it on the table between us, along with the manila folder containing photographs and printed point charts, and the composition book where I had tracked my weight loss and the physical symptoms I had experienced as my body began to consume itself to survive. Detective Martinez opened the notebook first, and I watched her face as she read through my accounts of conversations with Janet and my father, the detailed descriptions of the point system, the documentation of meals withheld, and tasks that became increasingly impossible to complete. She turned pages slowly, taking notes in her own pad, and occasionally asking me to clarify dates or provide additional context about specific incidents that stood out as particularly concerning or potentially criminal. When she reached the section where I had documented my weight loss and the physical symptoms I was experiencing, she looked up at me with an expression that mixed professional determination with personal anger. She asked me how much I weighed when I moved back into my father's house and how much I weighed now, and when I told her I had gone from 138 pounds to 93 pounds in 6 months, she closed the notebook and leaned back in her chair like she needed a moment to process the magnitude of what she was hearing. The waitress brought our food then, and Detective Martinez watched as I tried to eat slowly, tried to pace myself because my stomach had shrunk so much that even small amounts of food made me feel uncomfortably full quickly. She explained that what I was describing constituted multiple forms of criminal abuse, including financial exploitation, elder abuse even though I wasn't technically elderly, and deliberate infliction of emotional distress that could result in serious charges if we could build a strong enough case with sufficient evidence. She told me that the documentation I had collected was extraordinary, that most victims of this type of systematic abuse didn't have the presence of mind or the opportunity to gather such detailed records of what was being done to them. She said the point charts alone would be powerful evidence because they demonstrated premeditation and systematic planning rather than spontaneous cruelty or temporary loss of control during stressful circumstances. While I picked at my breakfast trying to eat enough to satisfy her concern without making myself sick, she explained the process of building a case against Janet and my father. She said we would need medical documentation of my current physical condition and nutritional deficiencies, blood tests, and examinations that would provide scientific evidence of the harm that had been done to my body through deliberate starvation and neglect. She also explained that we would need to establish that Janet and my father had acted with intent to harm me, rather than simply making poor decisions about how to motivate me to become more independent. This meant proving that they understood the consequences of their point system, that they knew restricting my access to food would cause physical and psychological damage, and that they continued anyway because the damage was the point, not an unfortunate side effect. Detective Martinez asked me about other family members or friends who might have witnessed changes in my appearance or behavior during the months I lived under Janet's system. People who could testify that I had been healthy and functioning normally before moving back home, and had deteriorated dramatically while living there. I realized how effectively Janet had isolated me from potential witnesses, how she had made it difficult for me to maintain relationships that might have provided outside perspective on what was happening to me. She also asked about documentation from my previous life bank statements from before I lost my job employment records that showed I had been financially responsible and capable of supporting myself, medical records that established my baseline health and weight before I moved back home. She explained that building a strong case would require painting a complete picture of who I was before the abuse began, so that the extent of the damage would be clear to prosecutors and potentially to a jury. After we finished eating, Detective Martinez drove me to the hospital where she had arranged for me to be examined by a doctor who specialized in cases of neglect and abuse. Dr. Rachel Thompson was a small woman with kind eyes who spoke to me like I was a person rather than a collection of symptoms, and who explained every step of the examination before she performed it, giving me control over the process in a way that felt revolutionary after months of having no control over anything. The physical examination revealed exactly what Detective Martinez had expected: malnutrition so severe that my body had begun breaking down muscle tissue to survive vitamin deficiencies that had affected my cognitive function and ability to concentrate, dehydration that had impacted my kidney function, and signs of chronic stress that had compromised my immune system and ability to heal from minor injuries. Dr. Thompson took photographs of my physical condition with my permission, documenting the prominence of bones that should have been covered by healthy tissue, the hollowness in my cheeks and around my eyes, the way my clothing hung on a frame that was no longer substantial enough to fill it properly. She drew blood for comprehensive testing that would provide concrete evidence of the nutritional deficiencies and metabolic disruption caused by months of systematic starvation. While we waited for some of the test results, Dr. Thompson sat with me and explained that what had been done to me constituted torture, that using food restriction as a method of control was a recognized form of abuse that caused documented psychological and physical trauma. She said that my body would need months of careful nutritional rehabilitation to recover from the damage that had been done, and that the psychological effects might take even longer to heal completely. She also explained that the documentation I had provided showed clear evidence of deliberate abuse, rather than neglect or poor judgment, that the systematic nature of the point system, and the way it was designed to make adequate nutrition impossible, demonstrated intent to cause harm. She said she had worked with law enforcement on similar cases before, and that the evidence I had collected was some of the most comprehensive she had ever seen from a victim who was still in the early stages of seeking help. When Detective Martinez returned with the preliminary test results, her expression was grim but determined. She showed me the numbers that confirmed severe malnutrition and explained that these medical findings, combined with my documentation, would form the foundation of a criminal case against Janet and my father. She said the district attorney's office would likely pursue multiple charges, including abuse of a vulnerable adult, financial exploitation, and conspiracy to commit those crimes. She also explained that we needed to move quickly because Janet and my father would return from their trip soon and would likely try to control the narrative once they discovered I was gone. She said abusers typically tried to characterize their victims as unstable or manipulative when faced with exposure, and that getting our evidence on record before they had a chance to craft their defense would be crucial to the success of the case. That afternoon, Detective Martinez took me to the district attorney's office, where I met with Prosecutor Michael Chen, who specialized in domestic violence and elder abuse cases. He listened to my story while reviewing the evidence I had provided and asking detailed questions about specific incidents and the timeline of escalating abuse. He explained that cases like mine were often challenging because they involved family relationships and gradual escalation, rather than dramatic single incidents of violence. However, he said the documentation I had provided was extraordinary, and the medical evidence was compelling enough to support serious charges. He explained that the systematic nature of the abuse and the clear evidence of premeditation made this a stronger case than many he had prosecuted. He said Janet's elaborate point system actually worked in our favor, because it demonstrated that the deprivation was intentional and calculated, rather than accidental or spontaneous. Prosecutor Chen also explained that we would need to prepare for Janet and my father to claim that they were trying to help me, that their restrictions were motivated by concern for my well-being and designed to encourage me to become more independent and self-sufficient. He said this defense was common in cases involving financial and emotional abuse within families, and that we would need to be ready to demonstrate that their methods were deliberately harmful rather than misguided attempts at assistance. He told me that the case would likely take months to develop and prosecute, and that I would need to be prepared for the emotional difficulty of testifying against my family and having my personal life examined in court. He also explained that there would probably be attempts to discredit me or characterize me as an unreliable narrator who was fabricating or exaggerating the abuse because I was angry about being held accountable for my behavior. While we were meeting with Prosecutor Chen, Detective Martinez received a call informing her that Janet and my father had returned home early from their trip and had contacted the police to report me missing. She explained that this was actually good news because it established their awareness that I was gone and would prevent them from claiming later that they hadn't realized anything was wrong or that they assumed I had simply decided to leave for normal reasons. Prosecutor Chen suggested that Detective Martinez contact Jeanette and my father to let them know I was safe, and that I had come forward with allegations of abuse that were being investigated. He said their initial reactions to these allegations would be important evidence, and that we wanted to document their responses before they had time to consult with attorneys or coordinate their stories. Detective Martinez made the call while I sat in the prosecutor's office feeling a mixture of terror and relief that the confrontation I had been dreading was finally beginning. I could hear Jeanette's voice through the phone even though Detective Martinez had not put the call on speaker, and I could tell from the pitch and volume that she was already shifting into the defensive mode I had seen her use whenever anyone questioned her methods or motivations. When Detective Martinez explained that I had made allegations of systematic abuse and that the matter was being investigated criminally, Jeanette's response was immediate and predictable. She began talking rapidly about my mental health issues and my inability to take responsibility for my own life, and the difficult position she and my father had been put in by my presence in their home. She described the point system as a therapeutic intervention designed to help me develop structure and accountability. Detective Martinez let her talk while taking notes, and when Janet finally paused, she asked specific questions about the point requirements for meals, and whether Janet understood that the system she had designed made it mathematically impossible for me to earn enough food to maintain basic health. Janet's response was that she had expected me to be creative and find additional ways to contribute, and that perhaps the problem was my limited thinking rather than the structure she had provided. When Detective Martinez asked to speak with my father, he came to the phone sounding confused and defensive and repeatedly asking whether he needed to contact a lawyer. Detective Martinez explained that he had the right to legal representation, but that this was an initial contact to inform him of the investigation, and to give him an opportunity to provide his perspective on the allegations I had made. My father's response was quieter than Janet's, but equally revealing. He spoke about the difficulty of having an adult child move back home, and the strain it had placed on his marriage, and his belief that structure and accountability were necessary for helping me get back on my feet. When Detective Martinez asked him directly whether he understood that I had lost 45 pounds while living in his house, he was silent for a long moment before saying that he had noticed I looked thinner, but thought I was trying to get in shape. After the call ended, Prosecutor Chen reviewed his notes and explained that their responses had actually strengthened our case, Because they had admitted to implementing the point system and had acknowledged awareness of my weight loss, while characterizing both as positive developments rather than causes for concern. He said their immediate focus on my mental health and their defensive tone suggested they understood that what they had done was problematic but were trying to justify it rather than deny it. Detective Martinez arranged for me to stay in a temporary housing program for abuse victims while the investigation continued and the legal process moved forward. The facility was a small apartment building where residents had their own units but shared common areas and had access to counseling services and legal advocacy. The woman who showed me to my unit explained that many of the residents were in similar situations, people who had escaped family abuse and were working with law enforcement to seek justice. That first night in my own space with a locked door and a refrigerator stocked with food I could access without earning points, I sat on the small couch and cried harder than I had in months. Part of it was relief and part of it was grief for the family I had thought I had, and part of it was fear about what would happen next and whether I would be strong enough to see this through to whatever conclusion awaited us. I called Dr. Thompson the next morning because I was struggling with the psychological impact of suddenly having unlimited access to food after months of restriction and scarcity. She explained that this was a normal response to systematic deprivation, and that my relationship with food would need to be rebuilt gradually and carefully. She referred me to a nutritionist who specialized in working with abuse survivors and helped me develop a meal plan that would support my physical recovery, while addressing the anxiety and fear around eating that had developed during my time under Janet's control. The nutritionist, Sarah Williams, was a woman about my age who had experience working with survivors of various forms of abuse and trauma. She explained that food restriction was a common method of control used by abusers, and that the psychological effects could be as damaging as the physical consequences. She helped me understand that my fear of eating too much or eating the wrong things or eating without permission were trauma responses that would fade as my body and mind learned to trust that food would be consistently available. She also helped me understand that my recovery would not be linear, that there would be days when eating felt overwhelming or frightening, and days when I would want to return to the restrictive patterns Janet had imposed because they felt familiar and safe, even though they were harmful. She gave me strategies for managing these moments and emphasized that healing from systematic abuse required patience and self-compassion rather than judgment or pressure to recover quickly. Over the following weeks, Detective Martinez continued gathering evidence and interviewing potential witnesses, while Prosecutor Chen built the legal case against Janet and my father. They spoke with my former coworkers who confirmed that I had been competent and reliable in my job before being laid off. They reviewed my medical records from before I moved back home. They examined my financial history to establish that I had been financially responsible and independent before losing my employment. They also interviewed neighbors who had noticed my dramatic weight loss and deteriorating appearance during the months I lived with Janet and my father, but who had not intervened because they assumed it was related to depression or personal struggles rather than systematic abuse. Several people mentioned that they had seen me working in the yard or cleaning windows at all hours of the day and night, and had wondered why I seemed to be doing so much physical labor but had not understood the coercive nature of the situation. The investigation revealed that Janet had a history of controlling behavior in her previous relationships, and that my father's ex-wife had mentioned concerns about Janet's treatment of me to mutual friends, though she had not reported anything to authorities because she assumed my father would protect me if necessary. This established a pattern of behavior that supported the allegation that the abuse was systematic and intentional rather than an isolated incident or misguided attempt to help. During this time, I also learned more about the legal process and what would be required of me as the case moved forward. Prosecutor Chen explained that I would need to testify in court about the details of the abuse I had experienced, and that Janet and my father's attorneys would likely try to discredit my testimony by questioning my mental health, my motivations for bringing the case, and my reliability as a witness. He helped me prepare for these challenges by explaining the types of questions I might be asked and the strategies defense attorneys typically used in cases involving family abuse. He emphasized that my documentation would be crucial evidence that would support my testimony and make it difficult for the defense to claim I was fabricating or exaggerating what had happened to me. As the weeks passed and my physical health began to improve with proper nutrition and medical care, I found myself struggling with complex emotions about the path I had chosen. There were moments when I felt guilty for putting my father through the stress and public humiliation of a criminal trial, moments when I wondered if I should have tried harder to resolve things privately or simply disappeared without seeking legal consequences for what had been done to me. But then I would remember the feeling of sitting at that kitchen table with an empty plate while Janet and my father ate dinner in front of me. I would think about the deliberate cruelty of designing a system that made basic nutrition impossible to achieve. And I would remember that what had happened to me was not a family disagreement or a difference of opinion about how to motivate someone. It was systematic torture disguised as concern and structure. I also began to understand that seeking justice was not just about what had happened to me, but about protecting other potential victims, and sending a message that this type of abuse would not be tolerated, even when it occurred within families, even when it was disguised as help or motivation or tough love. Janet and my father had shown themselves capable of extraordinary cruelty and manipulation, and there was no reason to believe they would not do the same thing to someone else if they faced no consequences for their actions. The case continued to develop as Detective Martinez and Prosecutor Chen gathered more evidence and prepared for the possibility of a trial that would expose the full extent of what had been done to me and hold Janet and my father accountable for their systematic abuse and deliberate cruelty disguised as family concern. The trial began on a cold February morning, 8 months after I had walked out of my father's house carrying nothing but evidence of my own systematic destruction and the determination to expose what had been done to me. I sat in the courtroom wearing a navy blue dress that actually fit my body now that I had regained 28 pounds through careful nutritional rehabilitation and psychological counseling. But I still felt fragile in ways that had nothing to do with my physical recovery and everything to do with the knowledge that I was about to publicly dissect the most painful period of my life. Janet and my father sat at the defense table with their attorneys looking like respectable, middle-aged people who had somehow found themselves caught up in a misunderstanding rather than individuals who had systematically tortured someone they claimed to love. Janet wore a conservative gray suit and kept her hands folded in her lap in a way that projected calm authority, while my father looked older and more tired than I remembered him, appearing almost confused about how we had arrived at this moment of public reckoning. Prosecutor Chen stood to deliver his opening statement, and I watched the faces of the jurors as he explained what they would hear over the coming days: the systematic starvation of a vulnerable adult through an elaborate point system designed to make basic nutrition impossible to achieve, the deliberate isolation from support systems and employment opportunities, the psychological manipulation disguised as concern for personal development and accountability. He told them they would see evidence of premeditation and calculation, that this was not a case of poor judgment or misguided attempts to help, but rather deliberate cruelty designed to break down another human being's sense of self-worth and ability to function independently. He explained that the defendants had created conditions that caused their victim to lose 45 pounds in 6 months, and that medical evidence would show the severe nutritional deficiencies and physical damage that resulted from their systematic abuse. When Janet's attorney rose to present her opening statement, she immediately began painting a picture of me as an unstable adult who had taken advantage of my family's generosity and then fabricated allegations of abuse when asked to take responsibility for my own life and contribute to the household that had taken me in during my time of need. She described Janet as a concerned stepmother who had tried to provide structure and motivation to help me overcome depression and unemployment and develop the skills necessary to regain my independence. She acknowledged that the point system existed but characterized it as a therapeutic intervention similar to programs used in treatment facilities and rehabilitation centers to help individuals develop accountability and self-discipline. She suggested that my weight loss was the result of my own choices rather than systematic deprivation, and that my documentation of events was unreliable because I had been experiencing mental health struggles that affected my perception of reality and my ability to interpret other people's motivations accurately. My father's attorney took a different approach, focusing on his role as someone who had been manipulated by his wife into participating in something he didn't fully understand, and portraying him as another victim of Janet's controlling personality rather than an active participant in my abuse. He suggested that my father had trusted Janet's expertise in dealing with difficult family situations and had not realized the extent of the harm being caused until it was too late to intervene effectively. The prosecution's case began with Dr. Thompson, who testified about my physical condition when I first sought help and the medical evidence of systematic starvation and nutritional deprivation. She explained that the level of malnutrition I exhibited could not have resulted from poor dietary choices or depression-related appetite loss, but required sustained restriction of caloric intake over an extended period of time. She walked the jury through the medical records documenting my health before moving back home and the dramatic deterioration that occurred during the 6 months I lived under Janet's system. She explained that the vitamin deficiencies and metabolic disruption I experienced were consistent with deliberate starvation rather than voluntary food restriction, and that my body showed signs of chronic stress and trauma that were typically seen in victims of systematic abuse. When Janet's attorney cross-examined Dr. Thompson, she tried to suggest that my medical condition could have been caused by depression or eating disorders, rather than external restriction of food access. Dr. Thompson calmly explained that the pattern of nutritional deficiencies and the specific ways my body had adapted to prolonged calorie restriction were consistent with imposed starvation, rather than psychological conditions that typically affected eating patterns differently. Detective Martinez testified next about the investigation and the evidence that had been collected, including the detailed documentation I had provided, and the statements made by Janet and my father when first contacted. About the allegations, she read excerpts from my notebooks that detailed specific conversations and incidents, and explained how the point charts demonstrated systematic planning, rather than spontaneous decisions about household rules and expectations. She also testified about Janet and my father's responses when initially contacted about the investigation, and how their immediate focus on my mental health, and their defensive explanations of their methods, had actually supported the allegations, rather than contradicting them. She explained that their admission to implementing the point system while characterizing my weight loss as positive showed awareness of the effects of their actions, combined with a disturbing lack of concern for my well-being. When my father's attorney cross-examined Detective Martinez, he focused on my employment history and suggested that I had a pattern of instability and difficulty maintaining professional relationships that supported the defense theory that I was an unreliable person who blamed others for my own failures. Detective Martinez responded that employment difficulties during a period of systematic abuse were typical, and that my work history before the abuse began showed competence and reliability. The nutritionist Sarah Williams testified about the specific ways that food restriction had been used to control my behavior, and the psychological effects of systematic deprivation. She explained that the point system Janet had designed was particularly damaging because it created the illusion of choice, while making adequate nutrition mathematically impossible to achieve, creating a psychological dynamic where I would blame myself for failing to earn enough food, rather than recognizing that the system was designed to ensure failure. She testified that this type of manipulation was commonly used by abusers to maintain control while avoiding responsibility for the harm they caused, and that the psychological effects could be as damaging as the physical consequences of malnutrition. She explained that my detailed documentation of the abuse was actually evidence of my clarity and competence rather than instability, because it required significant cognitive function and planning to gather such comprehensive evidence while experiencing the effects of systematic starvation. Several former coworkers testified about my professional competence and reliability before losing my job and my dramatic physical deterioration during the months I lived with Janet and my father. They described how I had become increasingly unreliable and distracted, and how my appearance had changed so dramatically that they had been concerned about my health but hadn't known how to intervene or what resources might be available to help. One supervisor testified that she had tried to reach out to me about employment opportunities, but that my contact information had changed frequently, and that when she finally reached me, I had seemed anxious and unable to focus on the conversation in ways that were completely different from my previous professional demeanor. She said she had wondered if I was experiencing substance abuse issues, because she couldn't imagine what else could cause such dramatic changes in someone she had known to be capable and dependable. Neighbors testified about observing me working in the yard and cleaning windows at all hours, and noticing my dramatic weight loss but not understanding the context of what they were witnessing. One woman testified that she had seen me scrubbing the driveway with a toothbrush on a Sunday afternoon, and had wondered why someone would undertake such an unusual task but had not realized it might be connected to any form of coercion or abuse. Another neighbor testified that she had tried to offer me food on several occasions when she saw me working outside during mealtimes, but that I had always declined and seemed anxious about being seen talking to her. She said she had assumed I was trying to lose weight and didn't want to be tempted by her offers of cookies or leftovers, but that my reactions had seemed disproportionate to simple dietary concerns. When it came time for me to testify, I felt every nerve in my body vibrating with anxiety, despite months of preparation and counseling to help me get ready for this moment. Prosecutor Chen walked me through my story methodically, starting with my life before moving back home, and the circumstances that had led to my unemployment and decision to seek temporary shelter with my family, while I rebuilt my career and financial stability. I testified about the gradual introduction of the point system, and how Janet had presented it as a temporary structure to help me develop accountability and motivation, while contributing to the household that was supporting me. I explained how the point requirements had been designed to make adequate nutrition impossible to achieve, and how Janet had modified the system whenever I began to succeed in meeting the original requirements. I read excerpts from my own documentation detailing specific conversations and incidents that showed the systematic nature of the abuse and the deliberate cruelty disguised as concern and motivation. I testified about the physical effects of systematic starvation and the psychological impact of being isolated from support systems and employment opportunities, while being told that my suffering was necessary for my personal growth and development. When Janet's attorney cross-examined me, she immediately began attacking my credibility and suggesting that I had fabricated or exaggerated the abuse because I was angry about being held accountable for my behavior and contribution to the household. She questioned my mental health and suggested that my detailed documentation was evidence of obsessive behavior rather than clear thinking and planning. She asked why I hadn't sought help sooner if the abuse was as severe as I claimed, and suggested that my decision to wait until Janet and my father were out of town to leave indicated that I knew my allegations were false, and that I was afraid of being confronted with evidence of my own irresponsibility and manipulation. She characterized my weight loss as the result of my own choices, and suggested that I had deliberately restricted my food intake to create evidence of abuse that didn't actually exist. I answered her questions as honestly and completely as I could, drawing on the months of counseling and preparation that had helped me understand that her attacks were part of the legal process rather than reflections of the truth about what had happened to me. I explained that seeking help sooner had been impossible because Janet had systematically isolated me from potential support systems, and that I had needed time to gather evidence and plan my escape because I knew I would only get one opportunity to expose what was being done to me. When my father's attorney cross-examined me, he took a gentler approach, focusing on my relationship with my father, and suggesting that I was being manipulated by prosecutors and advocates who had convinced me to blame him for Janet's actions, even though he had been trying to help me and had not understood the full extent of what was happening. He suggested that my anger was misdirected, and that I should be seeking reconciliation rather than punishment for someone who had loved me and tried to provide me with shelter during a difficult time. I testified that while I believed my father had initially been manipulated by Janet, his continued participation in the abuse after witnessing its effects made him equally responsible for what had been done to me. I explained that watching someone you claim to love waste away from systematic starvation, and choosing to continue supporting the system causing that harm, constituted deliberate cruelty regardless of who had originally designed the abuse. The prosecution's final witness was a psychologist who specialized in family abuse dynamics, who testified about the patterns of behavior exhibited by Janet and my father, and the ways that systematic abuse typically developed within family relationships. She explained that abusers often used legitimate concerns about responsibility and accountability as cover for controlling and harmful behavior, and that the gradual escalation of restrictions and requirements was typical of systematic abuse cases. She testified that the point system Janet had designed was particularly sophisticated in its psychological manipulation because it created the appearance of fairness and choice, while ensuring that the victim would blame themselves for failing to meet impossible standards, rather than recognizing that the system was designed to cause harm. She explained that this type of manipulation required significant planning and understanding of psychological dynamics, indicating deliberate intent rather than misguided attempts to help. When the defense began presenting their case, Janet's attorney called character witnesses who testified about her community involvement and her reputation for helping others, including previous instances where she had provided temporary housing for people experiencing difficulties. They described her as someone who had dedicated her life to helping others develop self-sufficiency and personal responsibility, and suggested that her methods with me had been consistent with her general approach to helping people overcome challenges. Janet herself testified that she had designed the point system based on therapeutic interventions she had researched, and that her intention had been to help me develop structure and accountability while contributing meaningfully to the household that was supporting me. She claimed that my weight loss had been incidental to the program, and that she had assumed I was trying to get in shape rather than experiencing nutritional deprivation. She testified that my documentation of our interactions was selective and taken out of context, and that my perception of events had been distorted by depression and resistance to taking responsibility for my own life. She claimed that she had tried to help me in the same way she had successfully helped other people, and that my allegations of abuse were the result of my inability to accept accountability for my own choices and circumstances. When Prosecutor Chen cross-examined Janet, he systematically dismantled her explanations by walking her through the mathematical impossibility of earning adequate nutrition through her point system, and her admission that she had been aware of my dramatic weight loss while characterizing it as positive progress. He forced her to acknowledge that she had isolated me from employment opportunities and support systems, while maintaining that this isolation was necessary for my therapeutic progress. He also confronted her with excerpts from my documentation that showed her deliberate manipulation and cruelty, including instances where she had awarded or deducted points based on her mood rather than my performance, and her comments about my appearance and worthiness that revealed her true motivations for the systematic deprivation she had imposed. My father testified that he had trusted Janet's expertise in dealing with difficult family situations, and had not realized that her methods were causing harm rather than helping me develop independence and accountability. He claimed that he had been focused on work and other responsibilities, and had not understood the full extent of the point system or its effects on my physical and mental health. He testified that he had noticed my weight loss but had assumed it was voluntary, and had been pleased that I seemed to be taking better care of myself and developing more discipline around diet and exercise. He claimed that when I tried to talk to him about problems with Janet's system, he had interpreted my complaints as resistance to accountability rather than reports of systematic abuse. When Prosecutor Chen cross-examined my father, he focused on the specific instances where I had tried to seek his help and protection, and his decision to support Janet's system, despite witnessing its effects on my health and well-being. He forced my father to acknowledge that he had chosen to prioritize his relationship with Janet over his responsibility to protect his daughter, and that his claims of ignorance were contradicted by his own admission that he had noticed my deteriorating condition. The defense also called expert witnesses who testified about depression and its effects on perception and memory, suggesting that my mental health struggles had distorted my understanding of events and led me to interpret normal household expectations as systematic abuse. They suggested that my detailed documentation was evidence of obsessive behavior associated with mental illness rather than clear thinking and planning. However, when Prosecutor Chen cross-examined these experts, he was able to establish that systematic documentation of abuse was actually a sign of competence and clear thinking, and that victims of genuine abuse often developed heightened awareness and record-keeping as survival mechanisms. He also established that the medical evidence of systematic starvation could not be explained by depression or other mental health conditions. During closing arguments, Prosecutor Chen methodically reviewed the evidence, showing that Janet and my father had systematically starved me through an elaborate point system designed to make adequate nutrition impossible, while isolating me from employment opportunities and support systems that might have helped me escape or seek help. He emphasized that the abuse had been calculated and deliberate rather than misguided, and that the medical evidence proved the severe harm that had resulted from their actions. He told the jury that the defendants had shown no remorse for the harm they had caused, and continued to characterize their systematic abuse as help and motivation, even when confronted with evidence of the damage they had inflicted. He argued that holding them accountable was necessary not just for justice but to protect other potential victims, and to send a message that this type of abuse would not be tolerated even when it occurred within families. Janet's attorney argued that the prosecution had failed to prove intent to harm, and that Janet's methods had been based on legitimate therapeutic interventions designed to help me develop accountability and self-sufficiency. She maintained that my allegations were the result of mental health struggles and resistance to taking responsibility for my own life, and that criminalizing attempts to help family members would set a dangerous precedent for family relationships. My father's attorney argued that he had been manipulated by Janet and should not be held responsible for trusting his wife's expertise in dealing with difficult family situations. He suggested that my father was also a victim and that prosecuting him would accomplish nothing except destroying what remained of our family relationship and preventing any possibility of reconciliation and healing. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on all charges against both Janet and my father, including abuse of a vulnerable adult, financial exploitation, conspiracy, and infliction of emotional distress. When the verdicts were read, I felt a mixture of relief and validation and grief for the family I had thought I had, and the father I had believed would always protect me. During the sentencing phase, victim impact statements were read, including letters from other family members who had witnessed the abuse but had not intervened, and from community members who had noticed my deterioration but had not understood what was happening or how to help. The statements painted a picture of systematic abuse that had affected not just me but everyone who cared about me and had been forced to witness my destruction without understanding its cause. I delivered my own victim impact statement describing the ongoing effects of the systematic abuse and the long process of physical and psychological recovery that would continue for years. I explained that the trauma had affected my ability to trust others and to feel safe in family relationships, and that rebuilding my life required not just physical rehabilitation, but fundamental changes in how I understood love and care and protection. Janet was sentenced to 6 years in prison, followed by 5 years of probation, with restrictions on contact with vulnerable adults and requirements for psychological counseling and community service focused on understanding the impact of abuse on victims. The judge emphasized that her sophisticated manipulation and complete lack of remorse demonstrated a level of calculated cruelty that required significant consequences to protect the community and deter similar crimes. My father was sentenced to 4 years in prison, followed by 3 years of probation, with similar restrictions and requirements, though the judge acknowledged that his role had been somewhat less central to the systematic planning and implementation of the abuse. However, the judge emphasized that his failure to protect his daughter when he witnessed the effects of systematic starvation constituted a profound betrayal of parental responsibility that could not be excused by claims of manipulation or ignorance. After the sentencing, I stood outside the courthouse with Detective Martinez and Prosecutor Chen, feeling a complex mixture of emotions that I was still learning to process and understand. The legal system had validated my experience and held my abusers accountable, but it could not restore the family relationships I had lost or undo the trauma that would continue to affect my life in ways I was still discovering. Detective Martinez told me that my courage in coming forward and the evidence I had gathered had made it possible to achieve justice that might have been impossible in other circumstances. She said that my case would likely be used as a model for investigating and prosecuting similar crimes, and that my survival and recovery could help protect other victims who might face comparable systematic abuse disguised as family concern. Prosecutor Chen explained that the convictions would likely result in changes to how social services and law enforcement approached cases of family abuse, and that the legal precedent established by my case would make it easier to prosecute similar crimes in the future. He said that my willingness to endure the difficult process of prosecution had contributed to protecting other potential victims and advancing understanding of how systematic abuse operated within family relationships. In the months following the trial, I continued my recovery process with the help of counselors and support groups and medical professionals who specialized in helping survivors of systematic abuse rebuild their lives and relationships. I learned that healing was not a linear process, and that there would always be triggers and difficult days that reminded me of what I had survived and lost. I also learned that survival could become a form of service, and that sharing my story could help other victims recognize abuse and seek help before it escalated to life-threatening levels. I began speaking at conferences and training sessions for law enforcement and social service professionals, helping them understand how sophisticated abusers could be and how victims could be systematically isolated and manipulated while appearing to receive help and support. The house where I had grown up was eventually sold, and the proceeds were used to pay restitution and legal fees, leaving nothing of the life my father and I had shared before Janet arrived, and transformed our family dynamic into something I could never have imagined. I realized that some losses could not be recovered, and that moving forward required accepting that the past I remembered might have been less stable than I had believed. But I also discovered strengths I had not known I possessed and developed relationships with other survivors and advocates who understood the complex process of rebuilding life after systematic abuse. I learned that justice was not the same as healing, but that both were possible, and that surviving could become a foundation for helping others navigate similar challenges and traumas. 2 years after the trial, I received a letter from my father written from prison expressing remorse for what had happened and asking for forgiveness and the possibility of rebuilding our relationship when he was released. I read the letter several times, trying to determine whether his words reflected genuine understanding and change or simply another attempt to manipulate me into providing him with something he wanted. I decided that forgiveness was something I might choose for my own healing rather than something I owed to him, and that rebuilding any relationship would require evidence of genuine change rather than words written from prison when he had nothing left to lose. I wrote back explaining that accountability required more than apologies, and that trust would need to be earned through consistent actions over time, rather than granted as a gift he could request. The letter exchange continued sporadically over the following months, with my father gradually demonstrating more understanding of the harm that had been caused, and the reasons why I could not simply forgive and forget, as if the systematic abuse had been a misunderstanding rather than a deliberate choice to prioritize his marriage over his daughter's survival and well-being. I also heard occasionally from Janet through mutual acquaintances, though she never contacted me directly, and continued to maintain that her methods had been misunderstood and that I had been an ungrateful recipient of help rather than a victim of systematic abuse. Her complete inability to acknowledge the harm she had caused or accept responsibility for her actions confirmed that my decision to seek legal consequences had been necessary for my protection, and for the protection of others who might encounter her in the future. 3 years after escaping from that house, I was living independently again, working in a new career helping other abuse survivors navigate the legal system and access resources for recovery and healing. I had gained back all the weight I had lost and had developed healthy relationships with food and exercise and self-care that were not based on earning or deserving basic necessities through performance and compliance. I had also developed friendships and professional relationships built on mutual respect and genuine care, rather than manipulation and control, and had learned to recognize the early warning signs of abusive dynamics before they could escalate to dangerous levels. I understood that my experience had given me insights that could help protect others, and that surviving could become a foundation for meaningful work and service. The scars from systematic starvation and psychological manipulation would always be part of my story, but they no longer defined my entire identity or limited my possibilities for growth and connection and contribution. I had learned that healing was possible even from the most sophisticated forms of abuse, and that justice could be achieved even when victims had to fight for it without support from the people who should have protected them. Looking back at the woman who had walked out of that house carrying only evidence and determination, I felt proud of her courage and planning, and refusal to accept that systematic abuse was normal or deserved, or something she should endure in silence. She had saved not just herself but potentially countless others who might have encountered the same abusers if their crimes had remained hidden and unpunished. The legal system had worked imperfectly but ultimately effectively to hold my abusers accountable and validate my experience, and protect the community from their calculated cruelty disguised as concern and help. The process had been difficult and re-traumatizing at times, but it had also been empowering and healing and transformative in ways I could not have anticipated when I first walked into that coffee shop to meet Detective Martinez. My story had become part of a larger movement to recognize and address family abuse, and to support survivors in seeking justice and healing rather than accepting that systematic cruelty should be tolerated when it occurred within families or was disguised as help and motivation and tough love. I had learned that speaking truth could be dangerous, but that silence was often more dangerous, and that survivors had the right to seek accountability even when society preferred that they forgive and forget and move on quietly. The woman I had become was stronger and wiser and more compassionate than the woman I had been before the abuse began, and while I would never be grateful for what had been done to me, I could appreciate the person I had become through the process of surviving and healing and fighting for justice. I had learned that family could be chosen as well as inherited, and that love should never require accepting harm, or tolerating cruelty, or earning basic necessities through performance and compliance. The day I graduated from law school 5 years after walking out of that house with nothing but evidence of my own destruction, I stood in my cap and gown feeling like I was wearing the armor of someone who had fought the hardest battle of her life, and emerged, not just victorious, but transformed into a warrior capable of protecting others. The ceremony felt surreal because I kept thinking about the woman who had weighed 93 pounds and could barely think clearly enough to plan her escape, and marveling at how far she had traveled to become someone who could navigate complex legal concepts and advocate effectively for people whose voices had been silenced by systematic abuse. My law school classmates knew pieces of my story because I had spoken openly about my experience during our courses on family law and criminal justice, but most of them could not fully comprehend the journey from victim to survivor to advocate that had shaped every aspect of my legal education and career goals. They saw someone who was passionate about justice and uncommonly dedicated to understanding the nuances of abuse prosecution, but they could not imagine the nights I had spent reviewing case law while fighting panic attacks triggered by memories of systematic starvation and psychological manipulation. The law firm where I had accepted a position specializing in family abuse cases was small but highly respected for their commitment to representing survivors and holding abusers accountable through both criminal prosecution and civil litigation. The senior partner Maria Santos had built her career on cases that other attorneys considered too difficult or too emotional or too politically complicated, and she had specifically recruited me because she believed that my personal experience combined with my legal training would make me uniquely effective at helping clients navigate the complex intersection of trauma and justice. During my first week at the firm, I was assigned to work with a woman named Rebecca Chen, whose adult son had been systematically isolating her from family and friends while gradually taking control of her finances and medical decisions under the guise of helping her manage the challenges of aging. Rebecca's situation was different from mine in its specific details, but the underlying patterns of control and manipulation were disturbingly familiar, and I found myself able to identify evidence and legal strategies that might have been overlooked by attorneys who had not personally experienced sophisticated psychological abuse. Rebecca had been reluctant to pursue legal action against her son because she felt guilty about the possibility of sending him to prison, and because she worried that people would think she was being vindictive or ungrateful for his assistance with tasks that had become difficult for her to manage independently. I spent hours with her explaining that seeking accountability was not the same as seeking revenge, and that protecting herself and other potential victims was more important than maintaining family relationships that were based on exploitation rather than genuine care and respect. Working with Rebecca reminded me of my own struggle to understand that what was happening to me constituted abuse rather than help, and I was able to help her recognize the deliberate patterns in her son's behavior that were designed to make her question her own judgment and accept increasing levels of control and isolation. I helped her document the systematic ways he had undermined her independence and manipulated her into believing that she was incapable of making her own decisions about her finances and healthcare and living situation. The case took 18 months to prosecute successfully. But when Rebecca's son was convicted of elder abuse and financial exploitation, she told me that working with someone who truly understood the psychological dynamics of family abuse had made all the difference in her ability to pursue justice and begin rebuilding her sense of autonomy and self-worth. She said that having an attorney who did not question whether her experience was real or significant had been crucial to her healing process and her ability to trust the legal system to protect her. Rebecca's case was the first of many that would define my career over the following years as I developed expertise in recognizing and prosecuting sophisticated forms of abuse that were often overlooked or minimized by legal professionals who had not experienced the subtle but devastating effects of systematic psychological manipulation, combined with practical control over basic necessities like food, shelter, and financial resources. I also began working with Detective Martinez again, who had been promoted to head a specialized unit focusing on family abuse cases, and who regularly consulted with me about investigations involving complex psychological manipulation and systematic control. She said that my ability to recognize patterns that other people missed, and my understanding of how abusers operated psychologically, had become invaluable to her team's success in building strong cases that could withstand the sophisticated defense strategies typically employed in family abuse prosecutions. One of the most challenging cases we worked together involved a teenager named David, whose parents had been using food restriction and educational deprivation to control his behavior and isolate him from potential support systems, including teachers and counselors who might have recognized that his compliance and academic struggles were the result of systematic abuse rather than learning disabilities or behavioral problems. David's parents had convinced school officials that he required specialized disciplinary interventions and had obtained permission to withdraw him from regular classes and social activities, while supposedly providing private tutoring and therapeutic support at home. In reality, they had been using techniques similar to those Janet had employed with me, including point systems that made adequate nutrition contingent on impossible performance standards, and isolation from any adults who might question their methods or offer alternative perspectives. The case was particularly difficult because David had been conditioned to believe that he deserved the treatment he was receiving, and that his parents were making extraordinary sacrifices to help him overcome personal deficiencies that made him difficult to love and teach and manage. He had internalized their explanations for his suffering so completely that he initially resisted efforts to help him, and defended his parents against allegations that they were harming him rather than helping him develop discipline and character. Working with David required all of my skills as both an attorney and a survivor, because I had to help him recognize that what felt normal and deserved was actually systematic abuse, while also building a legal case that could prove criminal behavior rather than unconventional but legal parenting choices. I spent months helping him understand that love should not require earning basic necessities through performance, and that parents who genuinely cared about his well-being would not design systems that made his survival contingent on meeting impossible standards. The breakthrough came when David finally understood that his parents' explanations for their methods did not align with the actual effects of those methods, and that genuine concern for his development would not require systematic deprivation that was damaging his physical health and psychological well-being. Once he was able to see the contradictions between their stated intentions and their actual behavior, he began to remember incidents and conversations that revealed the calculated cruelty behind their supposedly therapeutic interventions. David's case resulted in successful prosecution of both parents and his placement with relatives who were committed to supporting his recovery and educational progress, without requiring him to earn basic care and respect through compliance and performance. The case also led to policy changes in the school district that required more thorough investigation of requests for educational modifications and increased training for staff to recognize signs of systematic abuse disguised as specialized parenting or therapeutic intervention. Over the years, I had handled hundreds of cases involving family abuse and had developed a reputation for being able to help clients understand and articulate their experiences in ways that could be effectively prosecuted, while also supporting their emotional recovery from trauma that was often deeply embedded and psychologically complex. I had learned that systematic abuse created specific patterns of thinking and responding that required specialized understanding, and that traditional legal approaches often failed to address the sophisticated psychological manipulation that characterized the most damaging forms of family violence. I also continued to speak at conferences and training sessions, sharing my expertise with other attorneys and law enforcement professionals, and helping them understand how to recognize and prosecute cases involving psychological abuse and systematic control that might appear less dramatic than physical violence but could be equally devastating to victims and equally deserving of serious legal consequences. One of the most rewarding aspects of my work was mentoring other survivors who wanted to pursue legal careers or advocacy roles that would allow them to help other victims seek justice and healing. I had learned that personal experience with abuse could be transformed into professional expertise that was invaluable in helping other survivors navigate the legal system and overcome the psychological barriers that prevented many victims from seeking help or pursuing accountability. I established a scholarship program for abuse survivors pursuing legal education and created internship opportunities at my firm for students who wanted to specialize in family abuse cases. I believed that the legal profession needed more attorneys who understood trauma and manipulation from personal experience, and who could help clients feel truly heard and understood, rather than judged or questioned about the validity of their experiences. The scholarship program had supported 15 students over its first 3 years, and several of them had gone on to establish their own practices specializing in abuse cases, or to work with organizations focused on supporting survivors and holding abusers accountable. I was proud that my experience had contributed to creating a network of legal professionals who understood the complexities of family abuse and were committed to ensuring that victims received effective representation and support. I also maintained relationships with the other survivors I had met during my own recovery process, and we had formed an informal support network that provided ongoing encouragement and practical assistance as we each navigated the long-term effects of systematic abuse and the ongoing process of healing and growth. Some of them had pursued careers in counseling or social work, while others had returned to their previous professions, with new insights about resilience and recovery that informed their approach to helping others. 10 years after my escape from systematic starvation and control, I received an invitation to speak at a national conference on family violence, about the legal strategies that had been most effective in my cases, and the ways that personal experience with abuse could inform professional practice without compromising objectivity or ethical standards. The invitation felt like recognition that my journey from victim to survivor to advocate had contributed something meaningful to the broader effort to understand and address family abuse. Standing at the podium, looking out at an audience of attorneys and judges and law enforcement professionals and victim advocates, I thought about the woman who had sat in that coffee shop with Detective Martinez 10 years earlier, weighing 93 pounds, and shaking with fear about whether anyone would believe her story or help her seek justice for what had been done to her. I spoke about the importance of understanding that systematic abuse often appeared legitimate to outside observers, because sophisticated abusers were skilled at manipulating not just their victims, but also the systems and professionals who might otherwise intervene. I explained that effective prosecution required recognizing the calculated nature of abuse that was designed to appear helpful or therapeutic, and understanding the psychological dynamics that prevented victims from recognizing or reporting their situations until they reached crisis points. I also spoke about the ways that personal experience with abuse could enhance rather than compromise professional effectiveness when properly integrated with legal training and ethical standards. I explained that survivors who became advocates brought unique insights about the psychology of both abusers and victims that could be invaluable in building strong cases and supporting client recovery, but that this expertise needed to be balanced with appropriate boundaries and self-care practices. After my presentation, several attorneys approached me to discuss cases they were handling that involved complex psychological manipulation and systematic control, and I was able to provide consultation and resources that helped them develop more effective strategies for supporting their clients and building successful prosecutions. These conversations reminded me that my experience continued to have value beyond my own healing, and that sharing my expertise could multiply the impact of my recovery by helping other professionals serve survivors more effectively. The conference also provided an opportunity to connect with other survivor advocates from around the country, and to learn about innovative approaches to addressing family abuse that were being developed in different communities and legal jurisdictions. I was inspired by the creativity and dedication of people who were working to expand understanding of abuse and improve responses to victims who had been failed by traditional approaches that focused primarily on physical violence, while overlooking psychological manipulation and systematic control. Following the conference, I was invited to serve on a task force developing new training materials for judges and attorneys handling family abuse cases with the goal of improving recognition of sophisticated psychological abuse and ensuring that victims received appropriate support and legal remedies regardless of whether their experiences fit traditional definitions of domestic violence. The task force work was challenging because it required translating complex psychological concepts into practical legal guidelines, while also addressing concerns about expanding definitions of abuse in ways that might be misused or applied inappropriately. However, I believed that the effort was essential because too many victims were being failed by legal systems that did not understand the full spectrum of abusive behaviors and their devastating effects on survivors. My involvement with the task force led to opportunities to provide expert testimony in high-profile cases involving systematic abuse, and to consult with legislators developing new statutes designed to address gaps in existing laws that allowed sophisticated abusers to escape accountability by operating within technical legal boundaries while causing severe harm to their victims. 15 years after my escape, I had built a career that felt like a direct continuation of my survival journey, and a way of honoring both the woman who had endured systematic abuse and the woman who had found the courage to expose it and seek justice. I had learned that healing was not a destination but an ongoing process, and that recovery could become a foundation for service that transformed personal pain into community protection and individual survival into collective empowerment. The law practice I had established with Maria Santos had grown to include 12 attorneys specializing in various aspects of family abuse, and we had successfully prosecuted hundreds of cases while also providing civil representation for survivors seeking financial compensation and protective orders. We had also developed educational programs for other legal professionals and had published articles and legal briefs that contributed to evolving understanding of family abuse and improved responses to survivors. Looking back at the journey from systematic starvation to legal advocacy, I felt grateful for the strength I had discovered in myself and for the people who had supported my recovery and professional development. But I also felt a continuing sense of responsibility to use my experience and expertise to protect others who might face similar abuse and manipulation. I knew that there would always be sophisticated abusers who used family relationships and societal expectations to exploit and control vulnerable people, and that there would always be victims who struggled to understand that what was happening to them constituted abuse, deserving of legal intervention and community support. But I also knew that every successful prosecution and every survivor who found healing and every professional who developed better understanding of family abuse contributed to a growing movement that was making it harder for abusers to operate with impunity and easier for victims to seek help and find justice. My story had become part of something larger than my individual experience and recovery, and I was proud that the woman who had walked out of that house carrying only evidence and determination had built a life dedicated to ensuring that other survivors would not have to fight alone for recognition and justice and healing. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.